Hello, anonymous viewer who is probably either a dungeon master or wants to be one. Are you worried that your idea for a dungeon might kind of suck? Well, here I am to possibly confirm your beliefs, or maybe prove you wrong and prove that your dungeon's great. Either way, I'm here to help, or at least I'll try to be. So here are 7 tips for designing an awesome dungeon in D&D. A bit of context, this video won't cover the very basics on how to design a dungeon, so if you're brand new to DMing and have no idea where to start, you might want to check out another video first. But don't go thinking that you need to be some kind of D&D expert to understand this video. I don't claim to be that. If you've ever ran a dungeon crawl before, or even played in one, or just understand the concept, then you'll probably be fine. Anyway, here's the list. My first tip is to give the dungeon its own atmospheric identity of some kind. When we're talking about fantasy role-playing games, the word dungeon has been given a much broader definition than its historical meaning, expanding from a prison underneath a castle to basically any contained and dangerous area for the adventurers to explore. At the same time, though, it seems as though DMs can be pretty unimaginative with dungeon atmospheres, too often restricting them to the traditional dry underground fortress full of square rooms and 10-foot wide hallways. That's definitely the classic D&D experience, but it can get kind of tiresome after a while, especially given the amount of time that dungeon crawls tend to take. Really, just giving it only one sort of distinctive visual flair can be enough to make it a lot more memorable, like making the chambers carved entirely in triangular geometric shapes, or describing the hallways as covered in purple phosphorescent fungi. Also, a dungeon doesn't really need to be underground either. It can easily be an above-ground castle, or a giant hedge maze, or even a chain of floating islands connected by rickety rope bridges. Your imagination should be no more limited than it is with any other aspect of this game. My second point is to make sure that there is a concrete objective, other than just killing everything. If your players go down into the dungeon with no goals other than just killing everything in sight, then you're pretty much asking for a very tedious experience. Not only are objectives like finding a hidden object or capturing a specific monster more engaging in terms of the story, they promote more creative problem solving like stealth and diplomacy over pure combat. Otherwise, your session will probably feel too much like a video game, and that's not an experience most people want with D&D. My third note is kind of related, and it's basically give the players choices. Don't go the Skyrim route of drawing a dungeon with only one way to the final objective. No player wants to feel like they aren't making any decisions of their own, otherwise they'd just be reading a book. Dungeons are one of the environments in which players most obviously have multiple paths to choose, because it's literal in this case, so taking that part away is taking a lot of the fun away. My fourth point is try to make the environment somewhat believable. Nobody's asking for complete realism, but if you just put a little bit of thought into how these monsters survive in the dungeon, it'll feel that much more alive. If a group of skeletons has been at rest for hundreds of years despite being right next to a room controlled by a goblin tribe, and wakes up as soon as the heroes walk into its unlocked tomb, then the players will probably raise an eyebrow. Likewise, unless it can teleport or shapeshift, the main entrance to a dragon's lair shouldn't be too small for it to fly through. Also try to think of a source of food and water for the inhabitants. Food could be as simple as eating each other or raiding surface villages from time to time. And for water, you should probably have something like an underground stream or well that's accessible to every faction in the dungeon that needs it to survive. In a dungeon with multiple factions, I personally like the idea of having it be in a neutral chamber, where the PCs might be able to talk to or even trade with a monster in relative peace. My fifth piece of advice is to make sure your encounters are unique within the dungeon. Keeping realism in mind can make your crawl more immersive, but if you think too hard about realism, your dungeon will probably collapse in on itself, metaphorically and perhaps literally as well. And one of the worst things you can do as a dungeon master is waste your players' time, and boring repetitive fights against the same monster can be a form of this. Sometimes you might have an enemy that sort of calls for this, like a xenophobic hobgoblin clan. But even then, you can try to have rooms with interesting and varied terrain, other creatures that make sense like trained wargs and ogre slaves, and some custom-made hobgoblin bosses with class levels to give it some variety. My sixth point is to be sparing when you're placing your combat encounters and monsters. There is absolutely no reason to populate every room with a monster to fight. Not only does it have a chance of breaking suspension of disbelief, it can make any dungeon of more than a dozen or so rooms really overstay its welcome. As an example, look at the trip through the mines of Moria in Lord of the Rings. It's probably the most iconic dungeon crawl scenario in all of fiction, and more time is spent on foreshadowing and non-combat challenges than on actually fighting orcs. I'm not saying that your dungeons need to be that sparse in terms of encounters, but dedicating a lot of your rooms to just showing hints of what's to come can give a welcome boost of quality over quantity. My seventh and final tip is don't be afraid to steal stuff. Some people really enjoy drawing their own dungeons and have the time and energy to do so. If you're one of those people, then that's great. But if one or both of those things don't apply to you, then the internet is great. Well, for some purposes, that is. And a huge source of dungeon maps is one of them. There are tons of places to find well-designed maps, some of which I've linked in the description. If any of you know of other good places, you can feel free to share them in the comments. So yeah, if you just take a map from the internet and fill it in with your own descriptive features and encounters, you'll be all set. Unless it's from a really big published module, nobody will call you out for it. So there's my 2 cents on improving dungeon design. If you feel that I've missed anything big or disagree with any of my points, then you can let me know down below. And as always, like and subscribe if you enjoyed and or want more D&D related content. Until next time!